have been beset by, just one second here. American Jews have been beset by increasing online threats and incidents of harassment and even violence. The internet is replete with anti-Semitic tropes and calls for violence against Jews, particularly in the wake of the COVID pandemic. This is just one odious entry on the internet. Anti-Semitic tweets have increased since Elon Musk has acquired Twitter. And as you know, recently, former President Donald Trump dined at Mar-a-Lago with Kanye West, who had already been denounced for statements demonizing Jews, and with Nick Fuentes, an outspoken anti-Semite and Holocaust denier. And so, unfortunately, anti-Semitism in this country is increasingly becoming normalized. You all remember the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville with the chant, "Jews will not replace us." Marjorie Taylor Greene claimed that forest fires in California are caused by Jewish laser beams from outer space. Basketball star Kyrie Irving posted an anti-Semitic film on his website. And Kanye West's declaration to, quote, go DEFCON on Jews is only the latest iteration of what historians have referred to as the longest hatred. Jewish houses of worship now need increased security. Jewish university students have sometimes been under siege on campus. And Holocaust denial continues on internet websites. But animosity and hostility towards Jews dates back to antiquity. And over the centuries, it has ebbed at times and flowed at other times. It has emerged in times of turbulence and crisis, and then subsides until the next crisis. The persistence of this ageless, self-renewing prejudice was put succinctly by the Russian author Ivan Turgenev, who in the 19th century, he wrote, "I hate Jews. Every time I see one, he reminds me of the sins I commit." A rather introspective look at anti-Semitism. In fact, everything that happened to Jews in Nazi Germany was rooted in the past. Ostracism, expulsion, deprivation of citizenship, physical isolation, physical attack, all that happened previously in history. The only Nazi assault on Jews that was without historic precedent was the final solution itself, genocide. But all the other attacks on Jews during the Nazi era had roots that went back deep in history. So in these three lectures, I hope to focus on why Jews have been targeted for attack for so long and in so many societies, how anti-Semitism has changed and evolved over the centuries, and what are the implications of anti-Semitism for American society today. So I think it's best to begin with a definition of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism refers to prejudice and or discrimination against Jews as individuals and a group. It's based on stereotypes and myths that target Jews as a people, that target their religious practices and their beliefs. But I would like to begin with a caveat. While I will be addressing the subject of antipathy towards Jews, we shouldn't forget that Jews have often been welcomed in European and American society, and that Jewish participation in the economic, political, and cultural life of Western Europe since the Enlightenment, that is an undeniable historical reality. Even ancient Rome was tolerant towards Jews for the most part. Therefore, anti-Semitism should not be overgeneralized as if it was present at all times and in all European countries. But anti-Semitism has been a factor in European history, although not necessarily a constant factor. It peaked during particular periods, then it receded, only to arise again. There are no simple explanations to account for anti-Semitism, except to say that it has existed over the ages and in even some places like Japan, where there are relatively few Jews. Now, it's possible to discern 4 distinct strains of anti-Semitism. There's religious-based anti-Semitism. There's anti-Semitism based on economic factors. There's racial anti-Semitism and political anti-Semitism, all of which has fueled hatred of Jews. The earliest manifestation of anti-Semitism was religious-based. So that's where we're going to begin. Hostility towards Jews actually preceded the rise of Christianity, but that was an antipathy that was typical of territorial conflict and hostility between rival powers. Jews refused to acknowledge the gods of other societies. They didn't partake in their sacrifices. They didn't intermarry, all of which fanned pagan hostility towards Jews. But that kind of enmity can't be compared to the attack against Jews during the Christian era. The most serious charge brought against Jews in pre-Christian antiquity was that Jews disdained pagan gods. Now, that's very different from the Christian accusation of deicide, that not only did Jews disdain other gods, but that Jews literally murdered the God of Christians. And that allegation, deicide, the killing of God, is one of the most destructive and murderous legends in all of human history. Christian anti-Semitism stems from the refusal of Jews to abandon their religious beliefs and practices within Christian societies. But there's an inner contradiction that lies at the heart of Christianity. The fact is that Jesus was born a Jew. He lived his entire life as a Jew and died as a Jew in first century Roman Palestine. His father, mother, and first disciples were all Jews. He never conceived of or even dreamed of a Christian church or a Christian religion. So initially, Christianity was seen as simply another Jewish sect, since Jesus and the disciples were Jewish, and they preached a form of Judaism. Then in the year 70, I'm not going to use the term AD, which is Latin for Anno Domino, or Year of Our Lord. Instead, I will say 70 CE, the Common Era. The Romans suppressed a Jewish revolt, and most Jews were then scattered throughout the ancient world. During the first few hundred years after the crucifixion of Jesus by the Romans, adherents of both Judaism and Christianity coexisted. They sought to practice their faiths in the same lands. Now, official Christian antipathy towards Judaism was discernible within 100 years of the death of Christ, at a time when Christianity was in competition with Judaism for a following. Early Christianity saw itself as the successor to Judaism, replacing the older religion as the inheritor of God's covenant with Abraham. Christianity claimed that God rejected his one-time chosen people because Jews had refused to accept Jesus as the Messiah. And consequently, Christians replaced Jews as the chosen people in the eyes of Christianity. So Christianity superseded Judaism according to Christians, in the eyes of God. The New Testament replaced the Old Testament. Now, the basis for the claim of deicide, that Jews killed Christ, was laid out in the Gospels, which were written 60 to 100 years after the crucifixion. And in the last books of John, they were written 120 years after Jesus' death by people who never personally met Jesus. But by then, Christians were a persecuted people trying to win favor in an oppressive Roman Empire. Thus, it was politically beneficial for early Christian leaders to blame the death of Christ on Jews, which was a competing religion, rather than to blame it on the Romans, who were oppressing Christians. So despite the fact that crucifixion was actually a Roman device for capital punishment, Christians absolved Rome of responsibility for Jesus' death and laid it at the hands of Jews. According to Matthew 27, Pilate said, "Then what am I to do with Jesus, the so-called Christ?" They all said, "Have him crucified." Now, when Pilate saw that, he took some water and washed his hands in the presence of the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this good man's blood. It is your affair." To this, all the people replied, "His blood be on us and on our children." And so thus began the Christian conception that all Jews, not only Jews living at that time, but all Jews for all time, bear responsibility for the death of Jesus. In fact, it wasn't until 1965 that the Second Vatican Council officially absolved Jewish people of the crime of deicide. Early Christian fathers increasingly portrayed Jews in a negative light. John, the last of the gospel writers, has Jesus accusing Jews of being children of the devil. "You belong to your father, the devil, and you want to do what your father desires," according to John 8. Gregory of Nyssa was a saint and an influential father of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And he referred to Jews as murderers of the Lord, assassins of the prophets, rebels and detesters of God, companions of the devil, race of vipers, informers, calumniators, darkeners of the mind, Sanhedrin of demons, accursed, detested, enemies of all that is beautiful. John Chrysostom, the most important figure in late 14th century Byzantium, he wrote, "The Jews sacrifice their children to Satan. They are worse than wild beasts. The synagogue is a brothel, a den of scoundrels." But while Jews were deprecated, they were not to be eliminated. Those who believed in the second coming of Christ believed it would only happen when all Jews accepted Christ as their Lord. Thus, the goal was to convert Jews, not to kill them. With the conversion of the Roman emperors in the early 4th century to Christianity, Christianity became the sole established religion of the Roman Empire. And the early church fathers sought to establish Christianity as the successor to Judaism. In the centuries that followed, Jews were forbidden to marry Christians. They were prohibited from holding positions in government. They were prevented from appearing as witnesses against Christians in court. And eventually, Jews were prohibited from entering the professions or from owning land. But Jews were much worse off in the medieval era than they were in the ancient period. In 212, in the Common Era, Emperor Caracalla bestowed full citizenship on Jews in the Roman Empire, whereas in the Middle Ages, Jews were social and legal aliens. They were deprived of the rights of full-fledged citizenship. They lived on the margins of society. In the Middle Ages, Jews lived under Christian and Muslim rule, two religions that sought to convert Jews. In the year 1095, Pope Urban II appealed to Christians of Europe to take up the sword and liberate the Holy Land from the Muslims. And that began what was known as the Crusades, a series of military expeditions carried out by European Christians against the Muslims from the 11th to the 13th century. The religious fervor that drove Christians on the Crusades was to have a direct consequence for Jews. Jews were the perfect target for the Crusaders. Right in their midst in Europe, there were people who were seen as non-believers. There were two types of non-believers in the Middle Ages. There was the infidel. The infidel didn't know any better. And there was the heretic, who did know better, but still refuses to believe, who knowingly and willingly rejects Christ. And that's the way Jews were perceived, as heretics. And so while Jews were not singled out to be killed in antiquity, during the Crusades, Jewish communities were attacked. Hundreds of Jews were murdered in the Rhine area and in York, England. And this is a woodcut showing the murder of Jews who are identifiable by their hats. And this is from France in 1250. So the Crusades was a watershed in Christian-Jewish relations. From the end of the 11th century on, at various times, Jews were rejected, plundered, and sometimes murdered, as seen in this woodcut of Jews being set on fire in the town of Nuremberg. Up to the 12th century, it was taught that the Jews who crucified Christ didn't know they were killing God. But by the 13th century, St. Thomas Aquinas taught the opposite, that Jews did know that they were killing God. And from that time on, Jews were expelled from one country after another. Here is a map showing the dates when Jews were expelled from these various countries. And so you can see that Jews were expelled from virtually every country. And look at these arrows, they're all pointing towards Poland, because Poland was the only country that actually invited Jews, because the Polish king and princes wanted Jews who had particular expertise in commerce to help build the Polish economy. But in other countries where Jews lived, they were made to wear pointed hats that would identify them as Jews. And a host of accusations were leveled at Jews during the Middle Ages. In the middle of the 14th century, the bubonic plague spread throughout Europe, killing an estimated 1/3 of the entire European population. And that prompted fear, superstition, and ignorance. People felt that someone had to be identified, to be blamed for this plague. And Jews were a convenient scapegoat because of the myths and stereotypes that were already believed about Jews by Christians. Now, although Jews were also dying from the plague, they were accused of poisoning wells and thereby spreading the disease. So here is a depiction of a Jewish person poisoning the well. But in 1348, Pope Clement VI issued a decree declaring that Jews were not responsible for the plague. But that still failed to prevent more than 60 large and 150 small Jewish communities from being destroyed by people blaming Jews for causing the plague. And these included atrocities in Basel, Cologne, Strasbourg, Zurich, among other cities. Beginning in the 12th century, Jews were accused of killing Christian children and using their blood to make matzah. I'll let you think about that for a second. This is known as the blood libel. It began when a Christian child was missing, and rumors spread that that child had been kidnapped by Jews, and Jews had used that child's blood. But to make matzah, for those of you who are familiar with matzah, it's hard to see how blood could possibly be an ingredient. Nevertheless, this blood libel, this accusation that Jews use Christian blood to make matzah, that has persisted into the 21st century. Another accusation leveled at Jews was called the host desecration. Jews were accused of spitting on and urinating on communion wafers, supposedly in an effort to symbolically kill Christ once again. Jews were depicted as being in league with Satan, with eating the excrement of pigs, as depicted in this woodcut. And Jews were sometimes depicted as sorcerers and vampires. Jewish men were even believed to have menstrual cycles. And so as a result of all of this, Jews were despised wherever they lived, sometimes set on fire. They were also confined to ghettos. Towards the end of the 12th century, church councils urged the segregation of Jews from Christian populations. By the 15th century, Jewish ghettos had been established in cities across Europe. These ghettos were enclosed by a wall and gates that were locked at night. Jews could leave the ghetto, but they had to observe a curfew. And they were required to wear yellow hats and badges that would distinguish themselves as Jews. By the end of the 15th century, Jews in Spain were subjected to the Inquisition. But despite the torture, many Spanish Jews remained faithful to their religion. And that led Ferdinand and Isabella to order the expulsion of all Jews by July 31st, 1492. Very important year in world history. Then, in 1517, came the Protestant Reformation. At first, Martin Luther actually courted Jews. He hoped they would convert to his brand of Protestantism. But when Jews didn't convert, Luther condemned them in language that would make some Nazis blush. He said, "Jews are real liars and bloodhounds. We are at fault in not slaying them. First, their synagogues or churches should be set on fire. Secondly, their homes should likewise be broken down and destroyed. Thirdly, they should be deprived of their prayer books. Fourthly, their rabbis must be forbidden under the threat of death to teach anymore. Let us drive them out of the country for all time." This is what Martin Luther wrote in 1543. And then the Enlightenment began in Europe in the 18th century. And that only fueled religious anti-Semitism even further. Now, the Enlightenment was an intellectual movement that emphasized reason and science rather than relying on faith or the authority of the church and the monarch. And so, with its emphasis on rational thinking and its attack on intolerance, you might think that the Enlightenment would herald a golden age for Jews, but that was not the case. Many Enlightenment philosophers were sworn enemies of the church, and they looked upon Judaism as an intolerant, fanatical, and superstitious predecessor of Christianity. Voltaire, the most prominent spokesman for the Enlightenment, was Judaism's harshest critic. He said, "The Jews are of all people the grossest, the most ferocious, the most fanatical, and the most absurd." He considered Judaism primitive and extreme, opposed to the rational humanitarian ideals that he cherished. He characterized Jews as, quote, an ignorant and barbaric people, the heirs of a history that was disgusting and abominable, enemies of mankind. He even justified the persecutions and massacres to which Jews had been subjected over the centuries. And those views were shared by other Enlightenment thinkers who were at war with the roots of the Christian faith. They were critical of many of the fundamental ideas of Christianity, which they felt originated from its Jewish heritage. So to them, the Old Testament was as obnoxious as the Gospels. And those attacks kept alive the hatreds and stereotypes that had been directed at Jews over the previous centuries. Now, as I stated earlier, anti-Semitism was not a constant in European history. And by the early 19th century, Jews in Central and Western Europe were emancipated. That meant they were accorded legal and civic equality with other citizens. So here is a map showing the dates when Jews were emancipated, when they were given equality with all citizens living in those countries. Many Christians thought that by giving Jews political equality, that would encourage them to assimilate, which in their view meant shedding religious and cultural traditions, meaning that if Jews were given civic and political rights, they would give up their Jewishness. Now, while most Jews accepted the idea of acculturation, they did not want to assimilate at the expense of giving up their religion. And so, despite becoming full-fledged citizens in many European countries, most Jews continued to adhere to Jewish beliefs and Jewish practices. And that stoked resentment from those in the dominant culture who wanted Jews to abandon their religion as their price for legal emancipation. So that covers religious-based hostility towards Jews. Now we're going to look at economic-based hostility towards Jews. During the Middle Ages, the church banned usury, that is, the lending of money for interest. Now, since most professions were closed off to Jews, money lending was the one profession open to Jews in Christian Europe. And that created a new set of stereotypes surrounding Jews as money-hungry and greedy. And because Jews were expelled from so many countries, the only way they could survive was through commerce, becoming peddlers and merchants, buying and selling secondhand wares, particularly clothing. They couldn't become farmers because of prohibitions against Jews owning property. Before the 19th century, Jews were accused of unethical business practices in secondhand trade, in petty commerce, and in money lending. After emancipation, Jews gained access to education and to middle-class professions. By the end of the 19th century, some Jews in Western Europe began to prosper as doctors and lawyers and journalists. More access to education and professions led to increased competition between Jews and Christians. And that competition reinforced anti-Semitic attitudes and stereotypes, as this caricature of a Jewish capitalist. The emancipation of Jews in the 19th century occurred at the same time as Europe was becoming more industrialized. But the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century brought with it poverty, insecurity, and disorientation. It was very disruptive. It cut the masses loose from their traditional agrarian moorings. And the resulting fear and paranoia led some to identify the evil forces responsible for their misery. And since Jews appeared to be the main beneficiaries of these developments, emancipation, industrialization, Jews were often blamed for the suffering that resulted from industrialization and modernization. And in such an atmosphere, conspiracy theories abounded. If Jews retained their distinctive dress, their culture, and language, then anti-Semites regarded them as an alien element within their country. On the other hand, if Jews assimilated, they were regarded as even more dangerous. They were perceived as the enemy within, indistinguishable from others. Now, Jews were once seen as dirty, stupid, and pathetic, as you can see from this medieval woodcut of a stereotypical Jew being laughed at and humiliated by Christians. And this is not a very powerful image of a Jew. It's a rather pathetic image. But by the late 19th century, Jews were regarded as much more threatening. By the late 19th century, Jews were perceived as wealthy capitalists exploiting the labor of Gentiles. So these two images, these stereotypes, are very different. The medieval stereotype of an uncouth, uneducated Jew, certainly not a threat to the Christian population, versus the early 20th century stereotype of the Jewish capitalist who would exploit Gentiles. And about the same time, in 1903, in Russia, the Tsar's secret police published a collection of forged documents that became known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which claimed to prove that there was a Jewish conspiracy to dominate the entire world. This conspiracy theory resonated with people who felt downtrodden, who looked for a scapegoat. But it didn't just resonate with the lowest classes. Henry Ford put his name and fortune behind the protocols. He published a journal, the International Jew, which highlighted the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And those forged documents, the protocols of the Elders of Zion, have been translated into every language and remains a bestseller in the Muslim world today. And here you can see a Swedish version, an Austrian version, and I'm not sure where this image comes from. So we've looked at religious-based anti-Semitism, economic-based anti-Semitism, and then there was racially based hostility towards Jews. The nature of the attack against Jews changed by the latter half of the 19th century. Up until then, Jews were attacked for their religious beliefs because they refused to accept Christ as their savior, or for their economic position in society. But by the end of the 19th century, Jews were condemned not for their religion, but rather for their blood. By the 19th century, religious-based hostility was regarded as backward by intellectuals. A new paradigm for anti-Jewish feelings had to be found, one that would be consistent with the scientific zeitgeist of the late 19th century. Racism and anti-Semitism were facilitated by the development of social Darwinism. So Charles Darwin, in 1859, produced his Origin of the Species, and he advanced his theories that of evolution and struggle for survival of the fittest. And so social Darwinism was the product of philosophers who applied Darwinism to human society and claimed that the theories that Darwin applied to the animal world were also valid for the human world. And so racism resulted from this social Darwinism and pseudo-scientific notions based on theories of racial superiority and inferiority. focusing on so-called Jewish blood, which is a supposedly unchanging characteristic of Jews, that Jewish blood is different from Gentile blood, that it's the Jewish biological makeup that distinguishes Jews as a social group from those of the majority population in any particular country. It was a way to delegitimize Jewish equality with other groups. Ideas of racial purity in the 19th century also influenced religious identity, and that led to a notion of Christianity stripped of all Semitic influences. The German philosopher Johann Fichte claimed that Jesus was not Jewish at all. And throughout the 19th century, Christian theologians agreed. Illustrated books used in German Catholic schools portrayed Jesus, Mary, and Joseph with racial characteristics. Jesus with blonde hair and blue eyes, and Jews with darker skin and oversized noses, leaving the distinct impression that Jesus, Mary, and Joseph were of a different racial strain than that of Jews. And so by the dawn of the 20th century, Jews were increasingly being referred to as a race rather than as a religious cohort. Also by that time, the dawn of the 20th century, nationalism was growing throughout Europe. And nationalism emphasized what people in any particular country had in common. Common history, common culture, common language, things that bound people together as one people. But Jews living in those countries were increasingly seen as the outsider, the other, because the one thing that Jews did not share with the majority population was religion. And so Jews were increasingly seen as a people without a nation. Now, there were some real genocidal implications of this race-based anti-Semitism. Because when anti-Semitism was just based on religion, there was an avenue of redemption for Jews. That is, Jews could convert to Christianity, and they were no longer seen as evil, stupid, in league with the devil. In fact, in Christian Europe, a converted Jew was not only considered saved, he was held in higher regard than a natural-born Christian, because the converted Jew had seen the light. But racial anti-Semitism left no avenue for redemption and salvation. Even a Jew who accepted Christianity was now still considered biologically Jewish. You could convert your religion, but you cannot convert your genetic makeup. And so now, since conversion was no longer an acceptable remedy, the only way to get rid of Jews, in the eyes of anti-Semites, was the final solution. So in the Holocaust, Jews who converted to Christianity were still considered Jews and were targeted for extermination. So we've looked at religious-based anti-Semitism, economic-based anti-Semitism, and racial antipathy towards Jews. Now we're going to look at politically based anti-Semitism. The very term anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism as an ideology first appeared in 1879. It was introduced by a German. His name was Wilhelm Marr. He was an atheist who hated Catholicism as much as Judaism. He was married 4 times, each time to a Jewish woman. By the end of the 19th century, anti-Semites began to depict Jews as disloyal to their host nations, as traitors determined to undermine the state. In 1894, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jew who was in the French army, was falsely accused and convicted of selling military secrets to the hated Germans. Now, when evidence was discovered that Dreyfus was actually innocent, that evidence was quickly covered up by the French officers of the General Staff because they wanted to blame the crime on a Jew. In Russia, although most Jews themselves were extremely poor in that country, they were blamed for all the problems of the Russian peasantry, and the Tsar's secret police launched attacks known as pogroms against Jewish communities in Russia. And you probably have seen Fiddler on the Roof, which depicts one of these pogroms. And in an effort to explain Germany's defeat in World War I, anti-Semites invented the stab-in-the-back theory that the German army did not lose the war on the battlefield. Rather, Germany was betrayed at home by Jews. So this rise in political anti-Semitism coincided with the emergence of radical and anarchist movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in which Jews were portrayed as revolutionaries. Socialists and Marxists advocated programs to redress social and political inequalities. But those parties represented major threats to wealthy and religious groups. And Jews were disproportionately represented among socialists, communists, and Marxists. Now, that doesn't mean that most Jews were socialists or Marxists. Most Jews, in fact, opposed socialism and communism. But in the context of religious and political discrimination, there were many secular Jews who were attracted to radical movements that promised social and political equality and a complete rejection of anti-Semitism. And as a result, although anti-Semites had stereotyped Jews as rich and greedy, they also claimed that Jews were left-wing radicals and therefore a threat to capitalists. So here are two contradictory images of Jews. The Jew as a communist and the Jew as a terrorist, and also, of course, the Jew as a capitalist. Now, the seizure of power by Bolsheviks in Russia in 1917 that introduced communism to Russia and left-wing uprisings that followed World War I, all that ushered in a new wave of anti-Semitic hysteria. Political leaders and some major newspapers portrayed revolutionary attempts to seize power as part of an overall Jewish plot to take over the world. So, in this presentation, I've tried to explain the origins of anti-Semitism by focusing on its religious, economic, racial, and political roots. But as I previously stated, the level of anti-Semitism was not constant throughout European history. It tended to vary from country to country and within countries. Anti-Semitism would sometimes rise and diminish, depending on political, social, and economic developments within particular countries. For example, increased levels of immigration from Eastern Europe tended to heighten anti-Semitism. Those immigrants were relatively poor and not particularly well educated, and they competed with the host population for low-paying jobs. Also, the Yiddish-speaking new arrivals from Eastern Europe's Jewish ghettos with their unfamiliar customs and religious practices, that struck Western European Gentiles as very different from the more assimilated Jews who had lived in the West for centuries. Another factor in rising anti-Semitism had to do with economic crises in countries where Jews were seen as controlling major economic resources, tending to produce high levels of anti-Jewish feeling. Anti-Semitism also increased in societies where the political left threatened to challenge the status quo, whereas in countries where the political left was weak or declining, there were lower levels of antipathy towards Jews. So what is the position of religious, economic, racial, and political anti-Semitism today? Well, Jewish-Christian relations have vastly improved since the end of World War II. The Second Vatican Council in 1965, as I mentioned, withdrew the blanket condemnation of Jews for the murder of Christ. And Pope John Paul II acknowledged the historical mistreatment of Jews by Christians. The racial basis for anti-Semitism has more or less disappeared as the so-called science of race and eugenics have been debunked over during the 20th century. Few, if any, scholars today accept the notion of a hierarchy of superior and inferior races. And most scholars reject the concept of race itself. Most scholars regard race as merely a social construct rather than a biological fact. And the political basis for anti-Jewish feeling has diminished dramatically with the fall of communism in Europe. But nevertheless, economic anti-Semitism still persists, with allegations of inordinate Jewish influence in banking, in the media, in the arts. And some people blame Jews, such as George Soros, for the purported evils of globalization. George Soros is a Jewish humanitarian from Hungary, but he is portrayed as the root of all problems in Hungary by Hungary's President Viktor Orban. But on the whole, popular anti-Semitism rooted in religious, economic, racial, and political factors have very little support in Europe today. But there has been a rise in anti-Semitism on the political left, stemming from resentment towards Israeli policies in the Middle East. And unfortunately, the distinction between a dislike of Israel's policies and a dislike of Jews, that's become blurred in the minds of many people. That was best illustrated in 2002 with this cartoon that appeared in an Italian newspaper, which equates Israel's opposition to Palestinians with the crucifixion of Christ. I'm sorry it's not clearer, but this is the best version I could find. And what it shows is, it shows an Israeli tank, and its gun barrel is pointed at this infant. And the infant is labeled Baby Jesus, who says, "Surely they don't want to kill me again." So this conflates anti-Israel policy with anti-Semitism. Now, while it is true that Jewish-Christian relations have vastly improved since the Holocaust, relations between Muslims and Jews have deteriorated over politics in the Middle East. Now, in the next two lectures, I will be looking at the history of anti-Semitism in the United States. And so this concludes my lecture on the origins of anti-Semitism. And we have time for your questions and comments, and I will leave it to Jerry, who will unmute herself in order to recognize people who raise their hands.
Yeah, well, first of all, a comment from Anne Eve is, did Constantine and his mother hate Jews?
So Constantine was the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity, somewhere around the year 313 in the Common Era. Whether he and his mother hated Jews, I'm not aware of that, which is not to say that they didn't, but I am just not aware. So that's something I would have to look into.
Okay. And does anyone else want to unmute themselves or wave or put something in the chat? Actually, I'm going to unmute everybody. And then you can just go ahead and ask any question you would like. Actually, I wanted to comment that The artwork you showed was artwork that was in that series of programs I saw on the history of anti-Semitism in art, but there was more as well.
Mhm. Okay.
So I'm asking everybody to unmute.
We unmuted.
Ani, did you want to ask something?
That's about,
No.
because they were owed the money.
I see it.
Has anybody watched Rachel Maddow's show? Can't think of the name of it. She did a podcast about a guy in about 1933 or 6 who was a Nazi. There were a lot of Nazis in the US government. I guess you'll talk about that next week. I'm getting ahead of the thing. Getting ahead of ourselves.
Yes,
Yeah,
actually,
that
Ann,
was called Ultra.
I heard
Okay.
that podcast, and it's fascinating. If any of you can have access to it, is the title Ultra?
Ultra.
Yes,
It's
yes.
about a Nazi plot to take over America in the late
Shocking.
1930s and early 1940s. It really is fascinating. They have to make a movie of that.
And
They
I have
are.
no
It's
idea.
been optioned for a movie. I think
Oh.
Steven Spielberg has optioned it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's good to know.
I am
I'm-
shocked. I'm shocked that so few people know about that, including myself. I mean, I just can't believe we haven't been talking about that.
I will be referring to that in my upcoming lectures on anti-Semitism in America next week and the week that follows.
Don, do you find, or have you found that anti-Semites, as a general rule, are also prejudiced against other groups of people?
That's a very good question. I think anti-Semites in general are intolerant for whatever reasons. And I would be shocked if there were sizable number of anti-Semites who hated Jews, but did not have antipathy towards Muslims or towards others who were not of their religion. So I think it's fairly common that people who are anti-Semitic have intolerant views towards others. But what's disturbing about anti-Semitism is that it has lasted so long and in so many different societies. As I mentioned, even societies where there are no Jews.